Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie Skelly. I'm the program manager at Farm Journal Foundation, and I'm joined by Lisa Walsh, the project manager at Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, or ESMC. And we'll be providing an overview of our Climate Smart Commodities project and our learnings as we work with tribal beef producers on their grazing operations in Montana, Florida, and Oklahoma. So later, I'll hand it over to Lisa, who will present on the soil health aspect of our project as ESMC works to measure and evaluate gains from adoption of grazing practices that are part of this project. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I work for Farm Journal Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we're working to advance global food security, sustainable ag, and rural livelihoods. And farmers are at the core of everything we do. Our Farmer Ambassador program is a staple of our organization, and it's really built on the idea that farmers are leaders in their communities and the best representatives of what agriculture and farmers need to be successful. So we focus on bringing a diverse array of voices to the table to not only ensure that farmer needs are met, but the needs of our food system as a whole. So from the farmer all the way to the consumer. We bring lawmakers to the farm as part of our policy dialogue events. We bring farmers to Capitol Hill, and we facilitate many other opportunities for other voices in the food space to have a space to discuss the challenges and create solutions for our modern food system. Next slide, please. So you may have heard of Climate Smart Commodities. It's a program initiated by USDA in 2022, and it focuses on supporting a diverse range of American farmer, rancher, and producers to support them through climate smart ag practices. And our project focuses on three key pillars with our partners, Intertribal Ag Council, ESMC, and the Yield Lab Institute. And the first pillar being providing direct assistance to producers, and that will come in the form of direct incentives and payments to producers, as well as technical education and assistance. And then secondly, we're working on marketing opportunities through this project. So two of those opportunities are the American Indian Food Program that is provided by IAC and ESMC's Eco Harvest Program. And both of these programs are completely optional and voluntary for the producer to decide what decision best fits their operation. And then pillar three, we're really working on creating pathways for tribal producers to participate in USDA conservation programs. And we'll be focusing on those challenges and administrative barriers that some Native American producers face when seeking out USDA conservation programs. Next slide, please. So in this, I want to start out by saying, while I'm a representative of this project, if you're interested in learning more about working with the tribal ag community, I would encourage you to reach out to me or our partner, IAC. This project would not be possible without the collaboration and the trust and leadership that IAC has built within tribal communities. And I want to talk about the enormous role that ag plays in tribal communities and why this project is focusing on Native American producers. So ag is a leading economic development driver in tribal communities, and they have more than $6.4 billion in revenues reported by over 78,000 producers in 2022, which nearly doubles the revenues that were reported in 2017. So there's tremendous growth in tribal ag. And in 2022, American Indians and Alaska Natives farmed or ranched on 63.3 million acres of land. And the average tribal producer is younger than the national average, and the national average is 58.1, while the average tribal producer age is 56.6 years old. So despite these successes, we know that there's a greater need for support for tribal producers, and greater support for tribal producer means improving access to USDA resources, which our project aims to do. And it also means talking about and addressing the complex realities of working on tribal lands so that those producers can continue to play that vital role in land stewardship and nourishing their communities, and that huge role that they play in their agriculture communities. Next slide, please. One of the overarching missions of this project is to build institutional capacity in tribal communities, and that's where building trust and relationships has been an essential part of this project and will continue to be an essential part of this project. The Intertribal Ag Council represents more than 574 tribal governments, tribal organizations, and more than 80,000 Native American producers. IAC is the leading voice within tribal producer communities and government circles on ag policy and programs in Indian country. So with the leadership of IAC, our project has identified some barriers that tribal producers face when seeking access to USDA programs. And these are barriers which our project aims to provide pathways around. So for example, when a producer may seek access to the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, or Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, they may face a few barriers, such as their operations don't fit the standard model envisioned by policymakers. They may be smaller in land mass compared to non-native operations. And NRCS ranking criteria tends to favor larger land mass coverage, or the existing USDA programmatic offerings don't prioritize resource concerns that are uniquely positioned on tribal lands. And next slide, please. And while this table isn't all-encompassing, it does highlight a little bit more of those types of barriers that I just mentioned when tribal producers try to access USDA conservation programs. So in the first bucket, we can see non-typical operations. And a lot of this has to do with the complex history of our country's lands and how tribal lands were divided by the US government. So tribal producers are often operating within a complicated patchwork of land tenured realities. And this can include a mixture of trust lands, fee lands, lands owned by the tribes, tribal members, and non-tribal members. And the BIA, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, oversees about 55 million acres of land held in trust for Native Americans. And they, may play a role in making determinations for land management decisions. So that's just another path that Native American producers have to navigate in making decisions on their operations. We have also spoken with some producers when seeking support through NRCS programming. And while a producer may be eligible for the program or be granted a contract in rural areas like Montana, accessing contractors to do engineering work, for example, to put in miles and miles of water pipelines, may be hard to come by in rural areas. It may be hard to find those engineers that can do that work in those areas. And staffing issues within NRCS also make bandwidth issues a challenge. And then lastly, we've heard about communication issues. We know that there's a historical breakdown of communications, sometimes across different levels of bureaucratic processes that tribal producers have to contend with. And then we also see a lack of peer-to-peer communication offerings, which farmers in general rely so heavily on, that neighborly communication where you can connect with your fellow farmer about what's working best for them and their operations. And next slide, please. So how are we leveraging each partner's role in this project to create better outcomes for tribal producers and address some barriers that we're talking about? FGF will be focusing on how to collaborate and convene partners in a way that best serves tribal producers. So we're focusing on grant oversight and management and that connection to USDA and communications with USDA. And IAC is best situated to engage and expand opportunities and resources for tribal producers. So they're focusing on building those producer relationships. And then they also have a very strong technical assistance network that will help provide support to producers, as well as beef marketing opportunities. ESMC, and as I mentioned, we'll hear from Lisa in just a few minutes, is focusing how to reward producers for their beneficial practice changes. And they'll focus on ecosystem services and incentivizing producers to improve soil health systems and environmental outcomes through the conservation practices that they're putting in place on the ground. And lastly, we have the Yield Lab Institute. So producers are implementing these practices. What does it all mean for producer outcomes? So they'll look at the conservation decisions producers are making on the ground, the environmental data that ESMC is helping us to collect, and financial impact, feedback from producers, and hopefully link that to positive producer outcomes that we can then look towards the future, towards how to better serve these producers through this assortment of offerings that this project is providing. Next slide, please. And within our project, our goal is to enroll 70 to 100 producers in Montana, Florida, and Oklahoma, across 89,000 acres and 6,000 head of cattle. So producers will have access to about $10,000 per producer for practice implementation, and they'll have access to technical assistance and education opportunities, as well as those marketing opportunities through AIF and ESMC. Next slide, please. We intend to offer the following climate smart practices to producers, and you see a special emphasis on the first three as being particularly important to grazing operations. And as we began to speak with producers in each of our project states, they also suggested that we add the additional practices that you see on the right, which would make watering practices more feasible. And those practices are currently under review with USDA, so we'll hopefully be able to get those added to this list very quickly. Next slide, please. Currently, we have about 85 producers interested in our project through the completion of a producer survey in Florida, Oklahoma, and Montana. And next, we'll work with producers on enrollment, and that is with the support of IAC and a streamlined paperwork process that they're working on, and the support of our other project staff. And then next, we'll turn to ESMC and talk about their soil sampling and their data platform that they're developing as we look towards grazing practices. And I'll turn it over to Lisa here.
Thanks, Maddie. So hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Walsh. I am a project manager at ESMC. So I'll go ahead and start there of ESMC and who we are. So that stands for Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. We're a nonprofit that compensates farmers and ranchers who improve the environment through their agricultural practices. Some of these environmental improvements that we'll see is increased soil carbon, reduced greenhouse gases, and improved water quality. So we're aiming to do this through our market program called EcoHarvest. And that utilizes a digital measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification platform, which we call our MMRV. So going a little further into ESMC and EcoHarvest. So EcoHarvest program, it's our market program. It runs projects to quantify soil carbon removals and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from within agricultural production supply chains. And that's all done to meet the Scope 3 reporting needs. ESMC also has a research arm called ESMRC that serves as an innovation pipeline to invest in critical R&D and enhancements to our EcoHarvest market program. So that includes pilot projects such as this CSC grant, as this is the first time EcoHarvest is running a grazing program. And then the last thing about ESMC, we are a consortium. So it's a member-based organization. It includes buyers, sellers, and other stakeholders throughout the entire ag supply chain. So EcoHarvest is our market program, as I mentioned, and ESMC has created protocols, trainings, education, and other outreach materials in order to deliver this program. It's provided via an end-to-end technological and programmatic infrastructure, which includes a digital platform, as I mentioned before, called our MMRV platform. That includes a producer-facing enrollment portal where producers are able to go in, do data entry, and then our MMRV ingests, stores, and tracks that data along with other data we capture in order to generate these outcomes. Using the MMRV platform, we generate quantified and verified outcomes, and these outcomes or impact units represent the measured and verified greenhouse gas reduction and soil carbon removals that come from EcoHarvest projects and the implementation of regenerative agriculture practices. So the last bit of EcoHarvest and what ESMC provides is identifying buyers that purchase within the supply shed of where the project is happening for the sale of these outcomes. And an outcome is equivalent to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, either reduced or removed from the environment. So looking at the data and data that's captured within our MMRV. So we have 3 different categories of inputs trying to balance rigorous data to back up our outcomes while still trying to make the program easy to participate in and reduce data burden on our partners and producers, as well as reduce program costs. So you can see that we take soil sampling results and field data. We also do remote sensing, ag tech sensors, and other publicly available data. And then our last category is getting actual on the ground practice data from producers. And we take all 3 of these categories and input it into our MMRV platform. From there, all of that data that's ingested, tracked, and stored in our MMRV goes on to get modeled so that the outcomes can be generated. So again, the metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent reduced and removed from the implementation of these practices. It can also go through a third-party verification. And then after that, the last step is the outcomes are purchased. So again, ESMC will facilitate finding a buyer that purchases beef within the supply shed to purchase these outcomes. And those payments are directly paid to the farmer, which we call an outcome payment. So on the topic of payments, after 3 to 5 years of adopting regenerative practices, farmers can see increased profitability and healthier soils. However, farmers are implementing these practice changes in the first year of enrollment. So to help bridge the gap and cover transition costs, many eco-harvest projects provide an incentive payment up front, in addition to outcomes-based payments at the end. So Farm Journal Foundation and this CSC grant is implementing incentive payments to help bridge that gap and help with the transitional challenge of implementing them. Another transitional challenge that can be seen is support through implementing these practices and getting the on-site technical help. So providing this technical support through our project partners is essential to success, and IAC will be providing that technical support. And part of that will be working with the producer, getting the data, collecting it, and then inputting that into our eco-harvest platform. And then one more thing to mention, which has proven important to ranchers in our discussion so far, is EcoHarvest's Ag Data Transparency Certification and our commitment to ensure that we're protecting producer data that we are gathering. So here's the timeline for how year 1 and enrollment will work. You'll see the rancher activities on the bottom. So partner specialists will identify eligible fields and pastures for enrollment into EcoHarvest. And then they'll provide on-site technical support in order to help the rancher implement the regenerative agriculture practice change. After a year of data being gathered from that practice change, they'll input that into our EcoHarvest program. And then on the top there, ESMC activities. Within the first 6 months, we'll be taking soil samples of pastures as well as forage samples as needed. Once all that data is gathered and we have that all stored and made ready for our modeling partners, we'll quantify the outcomes. And then again, we will find buyers and facilitate the payment for outcomes. And that will get paid directly back to the producer. So looking at practice changes that are eligible to enroll, here are just a couple examples of the long list that Maddie showed before, and kind of what it is we're looking for and what we're quantifying. So you can see here in the baseline scenario of a beef grazing management system, you have methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide being emitted from cows, manure, and soil. This is going to stay the same in both scenarios. Those emissions don't change. However, what does change is the soil organic carbon that's being captured and stored within the soil. So in the baseline scenario, you have a smaller amount of SOC being stored in your soil. And then when you implement a rotational grazing practice change, depending on how rigorous that rotational and prescribed grazing plan is, you'll see higher soil organic carbon within your pasture soils because of the benefits to the pasture that are being seen due to rotational grazing being implemented. So when you have an intensive rotational grazing practice change and management system, we should see higher soil organic carbon in those soils. Similarly, another practice change is matching stocking density. And so that's just making sure that your animal heads that are grazing match the amount of acreage you have available on pasture. So again, your baseline scenario, you'll see a smaller amount of SOC. And after you enact that regenerative practice, the pasture benefits will be seen and should therefore increase your soil organic carbon. So these are the practice changes that are eligible amongst others. In order to actually quantify these soil organic carbon changes, we are using a model called SnapGraze. So SnapGraze will be assessing the potential effects of grazing management on the SOC values. It will be run by our partners, Earth Optics. And so over the past couple of months, we've been working with them to determine what kind of data is needed in order to run this model effectively and accurately. So the 3 bits of data that will be captured and required over the next year in this project will be a minimum of 3 years of historical data, just capturing general pasture management and information from how the pastures were managed these past 3 years in order to generate a baseline. We'll also capture 365 days of data of the project year. And so that's 1 year after the implementation of the regenerative agriculture practice change. So if you're implementing rotational grazing, it'll be 1 year of project data after you started that management. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, we'll be taking soil samples and forage samples, and that'll be part of the input to the model. The output from SnapGraze will be soil organic carbon values. So we'll be able to compare the SOC values between the project year and the baseline year to see what those differences are and see what the gain is from the practice implemented. So where we are at in the project and our goals. So as I mentioned, this is a pilot project. This is the first year that EcoHarvest is running a grazing program. So we're learning a lot and we're trying to develop a lot along the way. So we've been developing this program alongside the Farm Journal team with the CSC grant and all the other partners in creating definitions, determining data requirements, protocols, as well as outreach and education material for ranchers that are within this program. Another project goal of ours long term is that we would like to be able to see grazing data collection happen within our current MMRV portal. So in the first year, we are utilizing a logbook to do data collection. And then a long-term goal is to see how data collection worked in the first year in our logbook and be able to implement this into our MMRV for a long-term market program. And then lastly, our first year outcomes will go through internal ESMC QA/QC with a long-term goal of getting that third party verified after the pilot year. So our next steps in 2025 will be to get producers enrolled and start soil sampling within those first 6 months. And then on the ESMC side, we'll do buyer discussion and outreach to buyers that are purchasing beef within the Montana, Oklahoma, and Florida project space. Lessons learned so far in the CSC grant. First is getting grazing expert reviewers and consultants looking at some of our material. Those who are working grazing often on the ground, advising, to be able to determine if what we're putting out there for eligibility, requirements, and timeline makes sense to the ranchers and the partners that are actually working on the ground implementing these things. As well as before, learning how to best and most efficiently collect data through our logbook so that eventually we can take all of this data capturing and put it into our MMRV platform. So we're learning those lessons and we'll be continuing to learn those lessons in the next year of data capturing within our pilot program. And then the last is the timeline of ranching and grazing practice implementation. It's different than a cropping system where it happens on a calendar year, same time year over year. So how do we create a grazing program with a timeline so that all data is being collected and modeled on a relatively similar timeline? And again, that will be a lesson that we'll be learning over the past year as we try to kind of create this timeline for the grazing program pilot and onward. And I will hand it back over to Maddie.
Thanks, Lisa. And kind of building off of what Lisa just said about what ESMC is learning on in their role in this project and with this new grazing methodology, we're learning a lot of things at the producer and the project level as well. And is the case with many a pilot and innovative program, we're all working through various levels and multifaceted steps of implementing this program and getting it off the ground. And a lot of our hope is to incorporate some of that producer feedback into what we're doing when possible. So some of our first meetings with producers and other experts in the field of rangeland management led us to make a request to add those additional practices that I mentioned before to our practice list, which are under USDA review right now. We're also making some adjustments to not only incentivize producers for their conservation practice implementation, but also find other ways to get them resources in the form of funding and incentivize them for their time. So we've offered a small stipend to producers who complete our initial producer interest survey, and as a thanks for expressing their interest in the project and giving us some information about them. They'll receive a small stipend, as well as a stipend for successful enrollment in the project as they go through the process of completing enrollment and paperwork with our partners and with FSA. We're also strategizing how we might be able to build stepping stones with producers that lay the groundwork for enrolling in our project under prescribed grazing and fencing, for example, and which therefore may address some resource concerns that NRCS is looking for when a producer seeks to enter into a program like EQIP or CSP in the future after this project is over. At the project level, I previously mentioned how important trust building and relying on the expertise and experience of our partners has been. And that has enabled us to build a strong foundation for the project's forward movement. The negotiation and administrative legwork of getting this project started was an immense lift. And I think that truly highlights the importance of having the right collaborators in the conversation and the right people as part of the conversation. If you've spoken with or are familiar with any other climate smart commodity project, or maybe you're involved in one yourself, you may know that there are extensive data and reporting requirements as part of all these projects. So one of our goals from the start of this project and knowing what those data requirements were has been to be as transparent as possible with producers about what kind of data will be collected, how that data will be used, and how that data will be protected. And so we've had, numerous conversations with Lisa and her team about how that data will be used in a way that we can communicate it with producers. And we've also had to take a step back at times and examine how we're presenting information to producers in a way that makes them feel comfortable with participation and understanding what participating in this project means, especially on the carbon side of things. That's very new to everybody. So we're all learning in that space and putting the right information out there in a way that is easy to understand and digest is very important to us in how we communicate with producers. So making a framework for producer participation that is easy to follow is a goal of ours. And then ultimately moving forward, we hope that we can continue to shape and share this project in a way that amplifies tribal voices and encourages further collaboration with tribal producers in thoughtful, intentional ways on the ground as they work to implement these conservation practices and grow tribal agriculture. There's nearly 140 other climate smart commodity projects across the country, and it really is a monumental undertaking, but it also showcases the investment in American ag. So if there are ways that we can work together and help producers to get these climate smart practices implemented and get resources to them, and you're interested in learning more or learning about how we might collaborate, we're very happy to talk with you about other opportunities. Next slide, please. And lastly, we've included our contacts. So Lisa's email, my email is there, as well as our project website and QR code. So that is the landing base for our Climate Smart Commodity project there at farmjournalfoundation.org/tribal agriculture. So we encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or would like some follow-up conversation. And thank you for your time today.